Hello, my name is Işın Güler. I am the Assistant Program Chair of the STR Division, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event on behalf of STR. Let me start by thanking Cameron Miller for organizing this event. Presenting at conferences is something that we all do. It's a big part of our jobs. And we are really grateful that Russ Coff is here today to talk about that with us, that he's willing to share his experiences with you. Thank you, Russ. I'm sure it's going to be a great session. I will now hand it over to Cameron, and we'll get the event started.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So on behalf of the Membership Engagement Committee, one of the things we're trying to do is engage our members, right? And we want to try to do things that could be useful for you. And when I was asked to think of something, I said, well, what really stinks at conferences? So you know what? A lot of presentations. So I asked around and said, I'd like to get a senior person that's well known for being great at presenting, very passionate about helping people convey their ideas. And the name that kept coming up was Russ Coff, and he's somebody who I have met but haven't had you get these conferences, you're kind of like ships in the night when you're not in the exact same area. So it was someone I would love to learn more from. So this was a chance to engage him for myself and the broader community. So I want to thank Russ for doing this. So Russ is the Thomas J. Falk Distinguished Chair of Business at the University of Wisconsin. He's also the department chair of the Management and Human Resources Department. And then you may know him from his work if you've read anything about humans, human capital, uncertainty, and how that actually leads to competitive advantage. You'd be hard to not to miss his great body of work. So with that, let me just kind of start out kind of with a framing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Russ. So when I think about presenting at conferences, right, it's not just you're going to go do a presentation. You kind of think about this: what is the goal of what you're trying to do? So one way to think about this is think about somebody like Russ, right? You want to communicate to somebody like him, what you're doing, why it's interesting, and perhaps especially if you're a junior scholar, that he'll, when he goes back to Wisconsin, remember your name. Well, but here's the challenge, right? So let's say somebody like him goes to 3 sessions and they present in 2 other sessions, and they have a variety of other chats about research, at the socials and things like that. All of a sudden, think about it. He'll be exposed to 30, 40, 50 different ideas in a couple days, right? So how do you break through all of that noise? It's quite the challenge, right? And what makes it even more challenging is often when you're presenting at conferences, you're at papers that are, often in the, at some stage of development, often maybe in an R&R process. And this is quite a dangerous time because you're doing all of this work. The papers are often blown up to 50, 60, 70 pages. You have 10 tables and all of this stuff going on. And all the work you're doing is really important, but you cannot jam that into a 10 to 12 minute presentation, right? So you're struggling over what R2 said about a robustness test. That's not going to give somebody like Russ a takeaway. So when he goes back to Wisconsin, he remembers what you're doing. And when the paper comes out, he will want to read it, right? So you have all of this in your head. You're trying to break through a lot of noise that each of your audience members is going to have at the conference. And that creates, I think that's what gets us in these situations where a lot of these presentations are not all that great because you're kind of in the weeds of what you're doing, and people have limited cognitive ability to remember. So you need to be able to get your message across. So that's what I think Russ is going to kind of tell us a little bit about. So with that kind of intro and challenge, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm excited to have you here. Thank you for attending. Thank you for asking me. I thought my reputation was always a little bit dubious, actually, in terms of presentations. I am definitely somebody who will sometimes go out on a limb and do stuff, just experiment with stuff that's, let's say, not consistent with professional norms. But what I'll say is that professional norms are terrible. So anyway, thank you. Let me, it's hard to talk about presentations without slides, so I am going to show slides. Dive in. I'm happy to field questions as well as we go. So here we go. And it's going to take me just a second to make sure I can see you. And I want to be able to see the chat as well, just in case. Okay. Let's get rid of that part. Okay. So thinking about presentations, I am making my title is the point that I want you to leave with. If you leave with only one point, this is the point I want you to leave with. Do not present a paper at a conference. You want to sell your audience that they should read the paper, but there's no way in 12.5 minutes at a conference you're going to get through the whole paper. The important things, convince them that you've done a careful job. That's a super hard thing to do. If your goal is to say, here's why my paper is important, and have them walk away remembering why your paper is important, then you've won. And maybe they'll read it. Hopefully they'll read it. But if you try and go methodically through your paper, presenting all the sections of your paper, there's no way that your audience will come away understanding what it was that you were trying to communicate. And this is the challenge. I've sat through many presentations at the conference where my brain's not all there at a certain point of the conference. And so for me to sort of absorb what's going on in front of me, it tends to be limited. So, this is me. So Cam basically set it up as you have to convince me that I'm going to remember it. And I'm telling you, that's going to be tough. I'm going to start by giving you an assignment, if I may. All of you think about a presentation that you've seen at a conference that all it has to be is you remember it. You remember what was presented, at least broadly, something about what was presented. Because that's a high bar right there, if you remember somebody else's presentation. And then I want you to think about, well, why is it that you remember it? What is it about the presentation that is, in fact, memorable? So that's my first one, and that will maybe come back to us in Q&A. So I told you I was going to do some different things. One of the things that I do when I make presentations is I will on occasion show videos. So that's how I'm going to start. I'm going to show you a video. It is only going to be a short one, but it will make its point quickly.
So this was a thing I do called Life After Death by PowerPoint. Basically, don't do these things with PowerPoint. These are the things that people do that drive me nuts. And the only way to show them not to do this is to show them what not to do. So the biggest one I see, the most common PowerPoint thing, number one, people tend to put every word they're going to say on their PowerPoint slide. Although this eliminates the need to memorize, you're told, ultimately makes your slides crowded, wordy, and boring. You lose your audience attention before you even reach the bottom of your first slide.
So there's another 10 minutes of this comedy routine. So this is an example of selective editing. I just took that first part. But honest to God, this, when did bad PowerPoint become a comedy routine? And it could have been any number of academic presentations. I urge you to go see the rest of his presentation. It's actually pretty hilarious, if not realistic, of what academics do. I guess what I want to say is, in my time at Strategic Management Society, one of the things that we always struggled with is, why is it that practitioners they come to the conference and they don't find anything valuable at the SMS conference? Sorry to bring SMS in here, but it's our sister organization. And people would say, well, we need to have research that's relevant. My answer to that is a little bit different. gee, wouldn't it be nice if our presentations were good for academics? It's not just that they're bad for practitioners. They're bad for all of us. We would not do to our students what we do to our colleagues in terms of presentations. To our students, we understand that there's a certain amount of, let's say, edutainment that's required as we teach. We would not use little tiny fonts. We're aware of what messages our students leave with. If we would just be as nice to our colleagues as we are to our students, our presentations would probably be much better. And so that's kind of a starting point. So here's my overview of what I'm gonna cover. 3 points, and you'll see that one of them is going to be sort of a rule of 3. I'm not really a fan of rule of 3, like our journals say. Give us your 3 contributions. I'm not really a big fan of that approach to sort of writing. But if you have too many goals in a presentation, then you're not going to hit them all. So, really think carefully about what your goals are. So my 3 secrets to successful presentation: less is more. Don't try and present your whole paper. Think of it as a lengthy novel. What you want is a short story that is in fact novel, and you want to emphasize the novelty of your short story. You want to tell a great story, so the plot or contribution should jump off of the slides. Now, you might think that's obvious, but as I get into what I'm going to explain each of these things, and trust me, it's not the norms of the field by any means. The last one has to do with making clear claims about what your study can what the contribution is. We certainly have a lot of discussion in our field about what causal claims we can make. What I would say is be straight about what you can claim and what in fact you cannot eliminate, alternative mechanisms that you can't eliminate. It's okay. There is no perfect study. We can never eliminate all the alternative mechanisms. If you're really clear about what it is you can and can't claim, then you can avoid going into the weeds. And that's I think the big part of that message. Okay, so less is more. What does that mean? Tell the simplest story that you can, as few takeaways as you can, so that the remaining takeaways jump out at people. Avoid rabbit holes. I say present early and often. So if you can, present at your home institution, brown bags, get used to it. You've probably all done that. And you know that when you do that, you get questions after your second slide, maybe your first slide, and you're struggling to get through your presentation. And you know that if you bring in stuff that isn't at the center of your story, you're going to get sidetracked by the questions. Even by the nicest people will ask you questions that are going to take you someplace other than where you want to go. So to avoid rabbit holes, you present often and figure out what it is that you actually have to cover to state your clear contribution. I would say limit your literature review, limit the details of your study. You want to be clear about what you can claim in your study, but getting into the details won't necessarily be convincing. You'll see what I mean in terms of what I think you need to cover. Lit review, you're just not going to have much time. I am old and senior, and I can get away without putting a lot of cites on my slides. I think you can get away without putting a lot of cites on your slides as well for the Academy of Management. It's not like writing the paper. You don't want the cites on your slides to get in the way of making your points. And I would say also, in the theme of less is more, give them less to read. Fewer slides. People have different ways of presenting. For me, for an AOM talk, 12.5 minutes, 7 slides is probably good, because if I have more than that, then I'm not going to cover it all. Now you need to gauge your own utilization of slides, but the more you have, the longer it's going to take, just as a general rule. You don't want your slides to have any information that you won't have time to cover. You might think, oh, but these are important points. But if you don't have time to talk about them, don't put it on your slide. Less slide text on each slide. So I use large fonts. You'll see nothing smaller than 24 point on my slides, and that includes tables. Yes, that includes tables. I know small numbers because people just can't read that, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Bullet points, no more than 3 lines of text. Now, let me go back and talk about the process of presenting. I don't use a lot of animation. When I do, it's to direct people's attention. You'll notice that there's a lot of text on this slide. For me, this is a fair amount of text. I did use animation to get you to focus on the first point. And then, you know, it makes it clear when I'm on the second point. So I'm kind of guiding your eyes through it. But I'm aware this is a lot of text. One more point about animation. You'll see that you don't want distracting animation. Some might say that my animation between slides is distracting, and I won't be upset with you if you find it distracting. But I try not to have distracting animation. All right, you need to tell a great story. Understanding, you know, kind of what is in your movie. Your paper is going to cover a lot more content than your presentation can cover. So you really have to figure out, you know, what it is you're going to cover. My first point, oh my God, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands in a minute. How many of you have presentations that have a slide where the title of the slide is theory, data, findings, hypotheses? Raise your hands, or, you know, indicate, you know, in Zoom. Do you have a slide like that? Come on, be honest. I mean, we all do, right? It's a wasted slide completely, because everybody knows this is coming. Everybody knows that you're presenting a paper that's going to have theory, it's going to have data, it's going to have findings. People know that. If you really want to tell the story and have it jump off the slide, that title is a missed opportunity, because that's what people see. It's the big text, it's what people see. So instead of that, and I'm giving you some examples, for theory, instead of a slide that says theory, you might say, theory, M&A create value if preceded by hiring. Then that's a clear indication of what the theory is going to be about. Or instead of a slide that says results, a slide that says results, hiring increases value creation by 30%. Your main point is jumping off the slide, and to do what we normally do is a waste. And we can do better, is what I want to say. Use graphics, pictures, figures. You'll see that I'm using mostly text, which means that I'm not being very creative here. Well, I did put a video up there, but you know, a graphic or a figure is going to tell your story better. If it's not too complicated, it will tell your story better than just a bunch of text points. And note, I'm saying that text points need to be somewhat limited. Yes, I said, did you read this text, or were you looking at the picture on the slide? I would also say limit builds based on animation. You can see that I animated the first point because I wanted to spend a little more time on, I think it's a really critical one, that you use the space for your titles more productively than we as academics generally do. And these last 2 points, I figured I could cover them together. So I animated the first point, and then the second 2 points come together. And in a lot of my slides, I don't animate any of the points. So I'm thinking about, well, am I going to spend more time on one point? I don't want to have text on the slide displayed that you're reading while I'm talking about something else. That's what I want to generally avoid. Here's an example of video in a more research-oriented. I always keep an extra steering wheel in my car because you never know when you might need it. Okay, so I could have a line on a slide that says perception drives behavior and be done with it. I could. If, as Cam says, people remember my presentations, it might be because I'll do something like this. That was a 30-second video, and it's a strategic choice. If I've got 12 and a half minutes, am I going to take 30 seconds of it out on a video like that? Maybe, if I want people to remember that point, to really come away and remember that point. The paper is about, asset specificity is a really important variable in theory. And in practice, in theory, it's treated as though all actors in a transaction can objectively view asset specificity. In reality, perception can vary quite widely of asset specificity. What does that mean for theory? What does that mean for empirics? Anyway, enough of that. But you can see why that was a really important point for me to make in that presentation. I want you to be really clear about the claims that you can make on your results. We often wander into the weeds in an effort to make the case that we're being rigorous. The problem is that in a 12.5-minute presentation, you can't really wander too far into the weeds without losing your audience. So this is something that I worked with Miles on, understanding what are the causal claims that you can make. The starting point for that is being clear about what your research design is. Your research design will probably dictate what causal claims you can make. Beyond that, obviously, there are some robustness checks that you can do that may help you identify or exclude some mechanisms. You'll virtually never be able to exclude all of them. So what do I think matters? Well, I think you need to convey your research design. You don't want to fall into the weeds as you describe your methods or as you describe robustness checks. Why? Because those become important if your audience is convinced that you've made an important contribution that warrants them. I mean, who cares if you haven't said anything interesting, then proving that you've said it correctly becomes less important. So the first objective is convince them that you have something important to say, and on the surface of it, at least convince them that you've tried to be careful and that you understand things that you can't say based on your results. And then we get to, expressing our findings. Think about what is important of your findings to emphasize and make those jump off the slides. So let me give you an example, because I've said, no tiny fonts in tables. So let's think about what that means. So this is a typical table that you could find in probably any of our research, I would say. I don't think it's mine. It's not any better or worse than probably anybody else's. I did try and make the fonts as big as I could and still show the table. But I'm gonna guess that you can't really absorb all that much of this table. And it's even worse. You can see it on your screen probably, but imagine you're in the back of a room being presented. There's nothing on this that will actually, and you're tired because the night before you went to the NYU party. This is just your eyes are blurring when you look at this. So, but we don't need our audience to see all of that. So what do we need our audience to see? How can we be better at this? So I'll give you an example. This isn't perfect. Notice that here, the title of the slide, findings. H1A and H1B were supported. Well, that is true of this paper. H1A and H1B are supported. But if your eyes are blurring, you don't even remember what H1A and H1B were. So having that, even though that's true and it's important, it actually doesn't help you much. Notice that this slide is post-M&A human capital investment increases for growth, but decreases for cost-based synergies. Now we know what H1A and H1B were, so it says here's what I'm focused on. I'm only displaying here the coefficients and the standard deviations, which is probably most important, and we can see what's significant and what's not significant. The control variables and the maximum R squared are listed at the bottom. Notice that in that big table, there's no way you can absorb in the time that it's up there all of the control variables and their level of significance and their coefficients. But knowing what's controlled, people do want to know that. Knowing what's the range of R-square, probably people want to know that. But you don't have to do more than that. What's missing here? Well, the other table didn't even say anything about the effect sizes, and most of us really need to know the effect sizes to know whether the effect really matters. So if we look here, we see, you know, on compensation, a 9% decrease in pay for cost-based synergies, 54% decrease in formal training post-acquisition for cost-based. For revenue growth-based synergies, we have a 2% increase in compensation post-acquisition and an 89% increase in formal training post-acquisition. That's probably the important part of the story, right? The effect sizes, particularly on training, are not trivial, and that becomes important. Notice it's not even in the table that we normally show people. We wouldn't even list the effect sizes, but you know, we know it's important. Reviewers know it's important. Okay, then there's the question of, so this is me showing the coefficients, but in 12 minutes with five hypotheses, do I have time to present the coefficients and discuss them on all of them? Probably not, but if I can choose not to talk about some hypotheses, or I can present them in a more abbreviated way. So here I'm just showing the arrow of the significant findings. So compensation, informal training, and formal training. For growth motives in acquisitions, we see increases in investments in human capital. For unrelated buyers, we tend to see increases in investments. Cross-border is mixed. This is, you know, findings don't always go the way you predict. For quality, we see decreases in investment. For education, we see a mixed finding. It was easy for me to go through that with just the arrows. And what I would say is you have to decide, you know, do you have the time to kind of get through all the detail of your findings, and can you show it graphically? And I'm not even saying this is the best way of doing it, but I would say, again, less is more. You want them to remember, you know, what it is your main point is. So I'm going to end my presentation with what I started. Don't present your paper, sell them on reading it. Avoid PowerPoint poisoning. You don't want anyone passing out in your audience. It happens on occasion. And I guess with that, I'll end. And then we can chat. Oh, and remember that I said at the start, think of a presentation that you remember and why did you remember it? So, you know, maybe this is an opportunity for you to, maybe that primes some of the questions that you might have, or other examples, frankly, of what makes a presentation good.
Well, thank you very much, Russ. That was great. But I guess one thing I'd kind of, a couple things I'd add, or just thoughts I've had as trying to present. It's like each paper that you try to do is going to be different, right? So you kind of want to know what it is that you're trying to get people to remember. What is a core part of this story? And it's often, you know, I find different papers, if you were to say, here's 1 minute of, like, if I give you an elevator pitch on the paper, you know, how would this presentation map to that elevator pitch versus what the published paper would be? I'll just show you one thing, and I'm not claiming that I have a great example, but so if you see my screen, a couple years ago, this is SMS. I'm presenting this paper. This paper is now published. It has 4 hypotheses, a corollary, 5 tables. The appendix has, I don't know, probably another 6 or 7 tables, right? Basically my back end is this. I presented no hypotheses. in the presentation, and this also summarizes my results. There's a lot on the slide, but I spent probably 5 minutes with this up because it's key takeaways of everything. And when I tell the story, I can tell the story through this, and you're going to have probably the best way to come away with what I'm talking about. If I spent the time to write out each of the hypotheses, put it on a slide, they're long. And if you just see H2 by itself, it's rather meaningless. It only is important in the broader package of everything. So I think you have to think about how to sell what you're doing. And if people are interested, they're going to ask you questions about details. So if you pique their interest, you can get into the more nuanced stuff with them, often offline, right? If you have something where you have really interesting data, maybe make that clear, and that can start conversations after your presentation around it. But if it's just in this gigantic package and people can't see it and there's too much, then you can't even start that, those little conversations. You're definitely not going to send Russ back to Wisconsin remembering what you've done. So with that, perhaps we open it up to any questions. One thing that you might think of is if you're trying, if you have a particular challenge or you're thinking about presenting something, you would like to, get an idea of how should you do it or what should you focus on. Maybe that's something we could discuss, or any just broader questions for Russ or myself. So I'll just kind of open it to the floor. Feel free just to kind of unmic and just jump in. Yes, Christine.
Hi. I enjoyed the presentation. I agree that Russ, that the flicking over animation was distracting. Apart from when you were showing the cube with the thing, because you were comparing things, that was very useful, I found. Now, the question that Cameron was just showing with his last slide, if I was an audience to that slide, to me, it would be better to just have retained the titles in orange. What would be your recommendation on that?
So, something I forgot to say, but I some of the best advice I ever got, and why I say this about titles. Some of us have had sort of writing instruction back in like middle school, where we have topic sentences. Remember that notion that we have topic sentences for each paragraph, and that if you want to understand a broader argument, then you lay the topic sentences one after the other so that you can see without reading the whole thing. That's how we skim. And slides are the same way. You should be able to lay the slide titles one after the other and only have somebody only read the slide titles and still know what your presentation's about. And one of my colleagues, my marketing colleagues here, told me that one, and I'm like, oh my God, yeah, we're missing a huge opportunity. Yeah, you should be able to read the slide titles and know what the paper is about. And it seems obvious when I say it, but almost no one does it.
Yeah, I think that's something that surprisingly few people do. And I don't think one other thing about like having theory, empirics, putting those things on the slide, it's going to be obvious. Once you've seen 2 presentations, you know that 95% of the other presentations you'll see in your life are going to kind of follow a similar thing. So you don't need anything tracking you that this is a theory section. If you're talking about, ideas and, going to lay out a proposition, of course, that's the theory section. We don't need to be told that, right? So there seems to be a lot of work around letting people know where they are when you could just simply, here's a key message. And we all know where you are because most presentations flow in the same way.
Think about when you're writing, your center and side headers in your papers should be probably just as informative as the slide titles we're talking about. And think how many papers you read that they are not. That's an opportunity missed.
Yeah.
Because reviewers reading a paper, how often do reviewers miss your main point? No, don't say it, because I'm probably a reviewer.
Dean, do we have a question? Another question? Comment?
Hagen, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This is Kaan from Sabancı Business School from Turkey. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, should the presentation follow the format or the flow of a paper? I mean, should it proceed like, introduction, theory, methods, or can we be more creative in the flow of the presentation?
So I would not want to stifle creativity. So I want to also respond to Guy's comment in the chat. I use 7 slides as a rule of thumb because it works for me. But some people have slides that have 2 or 3 words on them, and it's only up there for a second. And I don't want to stifle that creativity. I think the issue is to make sure that your message jumps out, and people have different ways of doing it. And I'm not trying to. I'm trying to give you some guidelines, but not to stifle creativity by any means. I'm not, Kagan, does that get to your question? I'm not sure.
I'm particularly interested in the flow of it because when preparing this presentation, most of the guidance we got is that maybe you should follow the flow of the paper. I mean, it's like, the headlines of the paper in terms of the chapters. I mean, you are presenting the introduction first, and then you are switching to the theory, and then the methods. And most of the guidelines written for guiding the presentation says that you should somehow follow that track.
So probably most of us do that. But you'll definitely see some people who will present, here's the bottom line, not let me show you how I got there, which may also be part of how people write their papers, because usually the bottom line's in the introduction as well in the paper, so maybe that's consistent. I don't necessarily think that it has to completely follow the flow of the paper. Especially if you're thinking, I have to talk about every section of the paper, because you definitely don't have to talk about every section of the paper, especially if you have limited time.
One thing I would throw out there is that it often depends on, I think and this is kind of going to one of the questions in the chat, is you do want to understand the background knowledge of your audience. Now, if you're a presenter at AOM, you don't know who might be in the room, but there is also, let's say you're doing a study that adds something new to a well-known classics study that we could assume that most people have read in their PhD program. And if what you do maybe challenges that results or changes it some way, I could see a presentation layout where you kind of have this kind of provocative result that you show at the front, but it'll be fairly clear to most of the audience that they know the relationship between that X and that Y variable already, but it's changing in the presence of whatever you found. And then you could start to unpack that. But that might be a way to catch people's attention too. Remember, you have there's a chance that people might just walk out of the room, right? So you have 12 minutes, but there's no reason that people are going to stay for all 12 minutes, or if they're sitting there, tune in. So Russ is definitely not going to remember Wisconsin if I lose him in the first minute, because he tune out and think of he'll have his own ideas, start thinking about those things versus listening to me. So I think really capturing people in that first minute, and oh wow, this is interesting. Why, I want to see what's on the next slide. I want to see how you got there. That's really important. So I when I think about presentations, that the very beginning intro that gets people interested, the key message, and then how, kind of the key finding or takeaway. What are those things? That's maybe 3 slides. I spend 80% of the presentation on those 3 bits, and everything else is just enough to feel to get you to those things, or give you the necessary background. But yeah, so I think those things would be all be different depending on what type of presentation you're doing, or what your paper is, and what you can assume about your audience.
So I also want to respond a little bit to the background knowledge of the audience. We use a lot of acronyms, and some of them I used RBV and TCE, which in there, which probably a lot of people don't have a problem with, but it might shut out some people depending on kind of what your focus has been. Be aware of that, especially so I'm always trying to limit the text on a slide, so I'm tempted to use acronyms, but you do really need to think about what is your audience aware of. And so when you use an acronym, you probably want to define it, maybe on the first slide that you use it, define the acronym so that it's clear what you mean by it. I think this is what makes our presentations less accessible to practitioners. So sort of they're the ones that don't have the background in the literature most significantly. So, we want to think about that. I looked at some of my presentations, and I had way more acronyms than I showed you. So I'm aware of that issue. If I am giving a presentation to like a strategic human capital group and I use firm-specific human capital, FSHC, they'll probably get that, but somebody outside of that group, probably not. So I'll lose some of the academics. Let's see, Guy pointed out the dimensions 4:3 versus 16:9. Probably for many of us, most of our presentations used to be in 4:3. Now the default presentations tend to be 16:9. I don't think it much matters, although one of my colleagues once told me that it looks dated if you use 4:3. I don't necessarily think so, but I don't know. Do you find, let me ask you guys, since you just saw both kinds of presentations, is one easier to read than the other? Because I think that's ultimately the question.
I guess I didn't even know there was much of a difference. So
see, I wouldn't have, until I was told that my slides looked dated, I didn't know either.
Yeah.
Questions be used as cliffhangers? Sure, in our writing and in presentations. So you can have a provocative question as a slide title and get people thinking about it. Yes.
Of course, I think one of the things, if you're creating cliffhangers, stuff like that, is, to me, what's often more important is what you do than what's on those slides, right? So can you captivate the audience and do this? You can have an amazing background and perfect slides that we all agree, wow, that would be great, and still have the most boring presentation. And I've seen people present things where they're a master presenter and they just have they have a 50-slide deck, and they just pick through it in 3 minutes or 10 minutes, and that's not not something I'd want to try to do. But they can make it work because they're just have such a stage presence. But yeah, so I think just keep that in mind, like that. To me, the slides are to help you convey the message, but you're the one up there, right? So what do you need as your artifacts and things that help you perform? And I think people sometimes forget that too. I mean, it is part of the tool of your overall performance here. So don't forget about the performance side.
So I want to respond to Marcelia, because you're right. I focused pretty much on quantitative papers because I think we make our most horrible mistakes on quantitative papers, putting the tables with the little tiny numbers that no one can see. But qualitative papers present a different challenge, a similar challenge though, let me say, because there are so many rich quotes, and you as the author, you they're your babies. You're so excited that you have these quotes and you want to wade through those quotes. And you should be presenting some of those quotes. But ultimately, the contribution of a qualitative paper is going to be the counterintuitive intuition that you get summing across your data, right? So whatever that counterintuitive observation that you get, you want to make sure that that's the thing that people come away with. And yes, you need some really good quotes that support that that assertion, but you don't want to go so far into the quotes that people forget why you were going into the quotes, what the main contribution of your paper is. But definitely you want to be talking about quotes. Just as we've been saying, I don't think you want little tiny fonts. So you might have to select pieces of quotes or edit them down, put a few 3 dots in between when you cut part of a quote out, so that you can see how the quote supports your assertion in the paper, but maybe you don't read the entire quote, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so give me some examples either of an incredible presentation that you still remember because something about it was quite memorable, or I guess if one was really horrible, you can tell us a horrible thing that you saw in a presentation. I hesitate to open up that box. While you're thinking, I don't think Cam knows this, but I probably do have a reputation for presentations. Fairly early in my career, I did a paper with, probably most of you don't know Don Hatfield, but some of you do, and you're probably laughing now because you know him. And in the middle of the presentation, like somebody asked us a question, and it was a really basic question, like, is this variable significant or insignificant? And at the same time, Don and I answered opposite answers. One of us said significant, the other one said insignificant. And it went down in history as this presentation where the co-authors argued in front of the audience. So maybe not good to be known for that. But on the other hand, people remembered it.
Hi, Russ. First of all, thanks for the great presentation. I was just wondering if there is anything that you could tell us that you should completely avoid during presentations. Something like do not do that at all.
I don't know, tough call. I think I stick with the do's more than the don'ts. Your goal is to have the audience remember what your key contribution is. This is like really hard for us to do. So I recognize that what I'm asking is actually not necessarily easy. But too many of our presentations are, particularly when we're early in our career, we think, oh, what happens if I run out of things to say? Oh my God, I'm going to be standing up there and I won't have anything to say. But we know that never happens. That's just a complete non-issue. The real issue is that you're standing up there and you haven't gotten to the important stuff yet. And so that trimming thing that I said, that ends up being really important, because otherwise you're just going to have a whole lot of slides with a whole lot of points. If I had to come up with a don't do this, that'd probably be it. You can't do everything in a short presentation that you can do in the paper. And let me also say that doing those presentations will tell you, you'll learn what it is you have to emphasize in your paper. That's the whole point. That's why it's so valuable, because you'll learn, I shouldn't have said this because it led the audience down this other path. I shouldn't emphasize this in the paper either. It'll send the reviewers down a path that I don't want to go on.
I guess one thing, as I kind of said in the introduction, is it's very easy. And I think this is when you're deep in a paper, especially if it's in the review process, when you're working on the paper, you're often working on like some reply document that what you do there might end up in footnote 12, right? And it's really important to get it through the process because it's about, rigor and stuff like that. But don't talk about footnote 12 at all, unless it is just critical. And if it's really critical, it shouldn't be a footnote, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's often what you're doing right before you come to present in the paper. You kind of have to remove yourself from that and go back at the high levels. And what is this really about? Let's not worry about the details or what we're doing with the reviewers. What is just the key message? And I feel like that's something, especially PhD students and stuff tend to have a hard time extracting because every day they're living and breathing this, kind of deep in the paper, issues. But those aren't issues we need to know about or talk about unless they're substantial, and that's going to be part of the core of what your presentation is. So just try to keep all the weeds away from the presentation as much as you can. And it's hard to do because you're deep into it on the daily basis.
Christina.
Yeah.
It's the first time I'm coming to the AOM in Chicago. So the article is going through the process for revision and so on. So I'll keep in mind the footnote 12 advice. In terms of the audience, how varied or how heterogeneous are the typical audiences that I might expect at the AOM, say for my presentation or any presentation?
I guess I'd say that obviously the answer is it varies. It depends. This is management, everything. It depends. I think at the Academy, because there are so many papers going on concurrently, that there's a reasonable likelihood that the people in the room are people who are focused on the topic of the session. But keep in mind that it is not necessarily the case that all sessions are tightly organized around a topic. We like to believe they are, but they aren't always, in which case you may have some people in the room, or you may have PhD students in the room who haven't gotten as far in the literature. So even in a relatively homogeneous audience, which I think the AOM is relatively more likely to be, you'll still have some folks. I would argue still you want to make your paper accessible to people who are not ensconced in the area. Most of what we do should be, we should all have the absorptive capacity to understand what each other's work is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if you're doing it right, anybody who is there come away with the key takeaways that you have. That's different than them appreciating, what that really means for a nuanced literature in the same way. Because if you're not in that literature that are really involved with that conversation very closely, you might not appreciate some of the finer points the author's making, but you at least can know what the paper's about. And maybe you could tell a colleague, oh, I heard a paper like this. That's in your area. You might be interested in that. So I think that's maybe the balance. Any other questions or comments or? Well, thank you all very much for coming. Russ, thank you for doing all the heavy lifting on this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. I hope it's valuable.
Yeah. And if you have, this will be recorded, we'll have this up on the STR site. So if you have colleagues or students or anything like that that might be interested, feel free to let them know and have them check it out. And we look forward to seeing you at AON. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.